Well, brilliant. Look, it's fantastic to see so many of you here for this session, Collaborations in Museum Storytelling. This is a kind of follow-on to the first session you saw in the main room this morning. I'm going to let the speakers introduce themselves in a minute. But my name's Chris Michaels. I'm a researcher, consultant and advisor for the creative and cultural industries. If you do nothing else as a result of today, please sign up for my newsletter, Creative R&D on Substack, the best place to find out what's going on with digital innovation in the creative industry. So please, or you'll be welcome to join a fantastic community, many of whom are already readers in this room. Before we dive in, I'm going to ask our brilliant panel of speakers to introduce themselves. Then I'm going to show a quick video that kind of sets the scene for what we're going to talk about today. But first of all, Damien, why don't you introduce yourself to everybody?
Is this on? Yeah, great. Hello. I'm Damien Smith. I'm from ISO Design. We're a Scottish-based design and media studio. We kind of focus in on immersive content, primarily in the cultural industries. A lot of it is for museums and galleries. We also run an R&D team. We have a dedicated internal lab that works on kind of leading-edge technologies and their application to new experiences.
Hello, my name is Esteban, Botero, Creative Director at Event Communications. We are a company that is recently part of a larger group of companies under the Chargers Museum Studio Group. We, together with Met Studio, DPM in London, also with Leach, specialist graphics manufacturer in Huddersfield, exhibition fit-out contractors in the Netherlands called Hipsos, and similar company, much bigger in the States, called DMP, and most recently another company, publishing company called Skira. So all of us are called the Chargers Museum Studio. And I've been with Event for almost 10 years, and before that I worked at another museum and exhibition design company called RAA for about 6 years. So I've been designing museums for a while, which is a great privilege.
Hi, I'm Amanda Dimmock. I'm a content designer for Event. So that means I do museum content development and interpretation, focusing on storytelling. And I've been with Event for, 14 years. Where's the time gone? So yeah.
Great. Well, look, it's amazing to have you all with us today. What we're going to do this session is 4 things. We're going to talk a little bit about the UK design sector and why working internationally, and of course we're talking particularly about the Gulf, has been such an important part of these 2 companies' development, and get some kind of sense of the experience of doing that. We're going to talk about how museums are changing as storytellers, as spaces for design, and as places where experiences get shared with the public. Over the last 10, 15 years, a huge amount has happened to kind of move the sector on, and these guys have been very much at the coalface of it. And then we're going to talk about some specific case studies. In the talk this morning, you heard about this brilliant project in Oman, but there's so much more to talk about, so chance to break out. And then hopefully what we're going to have, and there's so many of you here, so again, fantastic of you to join us, is have a chance to have a chat. This is supposed to be the kind of the informal kind of breakout space, so it'd be great to hear your thoughts for the guys, your thoughts for each other about how museums and design are changing in a very changing world. So, but to set the scene for all this, I am going to try and get technology to work, which is where this is going to go horribly wrong. Press this button and hopefully magically a video will come up on screen. It just gives you some creative flavour for today's discussion. Right. There we go. Let's see if we can get that to work. There we go. of array of projects you guys have worked on together, and hopefully we'll talk about a lot of these. Actually, do you know what? I'm going to stay standing, you guys. So pass the mic along. A lot of what we've just seen on the screen has been projects taking place overseas, and I thought, we talked about Oman already today. Just be great to hear from you about the kind of the work you've done in international markets and why it's been good for you as designers, as practitioners, but also for the businesses you work. So, kind of maybe Damien, take us back to the beginning. Where did it all start?
Where did it all start? Well, ISO grew out of television. We were a TV graphics studio, perhaps the first studio outside London to discover After Effects. We're that old. And we mainly did TV titles for Channel 4, BBC, MTV, and so on. And we kind of got a little bit bored with television. It got quite formulaic. And my background was in club visuals. And I was missing getting into a location, into a space and bringing that to life and having people in a space and the physicality. And we stumbled into one of the early Millennium funded projects, a place called Millennium Point in Birmingham, that not many people have heard of unless you're from the Midlands, and it was the second biggest project funded by the Millennium Fund after the Dome. You may have heard of the Dome. Number 2 was Millennium Point, and we worked on that. We worked on a technology gallery, and it was an early precursor for creating a gallery as if it's a live website, in that every rear projected space and every exhibit was in effect a dynamically driven web experience, but it was using touch interfaces, it was using early motion tracking, it was using 3D sound. And we were like, God, this is amazing. This is like being back in Clubland and having that kind of fun. So that was probably about 15 years ago. So we pivoted into doing what we like to call spatial media or location-based experiences. And there are many positives in living in Scotland. There's many positives in being a studio in Glasgow. But one of the negatives is it's a very, very small market if you just focused on Scottish work. So we went to another country, we went overseas, we went to England, and we'd heard about this promised land where the streets were paved with gold. And there were certainly more commissions, and we've been lucky enough to work with a number of the UK's leading museum design studios, of which Event we've been working with for over 10 years. And the overseas side, I'll be honest, we didn't have any master plan. We ride on the coattails of these guys. So when these guys go overseas, we're one of the trusted partners or suppliers who go with them. So we don't do any sales, we don't do any marketing, we don't have international offices. We just ask these guys, where are you going next? And we get the passports ready and off we go.
Well, so I've been at Event for, like I said, around 10 years. And by the time I joined, Event was already doing projects all over the world, basically. But our founding directors, partners, who started the company, started from the expo scene, bringing in techniques from theater, bringing in techniques from television, bringing in techniques from all over the place and applying it to expo experiences. And then following that, they started bringing all of that toolkit into the museum world and really turning the museum experiences on their heads, bringing in projections, large projections, soundscapes, lighting, choreographing an experience as you would a show. So really groundbreaking work throughout the years. And one of the key moments for the company was always of course, the Millennium and the number of different projects that helped the kind of talent and skills that were being developed in the company really take hold and apply them to great projects. This was noticed around the world, and we started being asked to go to different places and apply these techniques and this knowledge, sometimes in places where there was nothing around. So, Oman came around in 2014 after a bunch of work that had already been started in the Middle East and other countries. for me personally, the first time I went to the Middle East was in Bahrain. I was working with RAA, and we were developing a project that was also a project that was kind of similar to the one that we presented this morning, that it was also a national story, and that was in 2008. So I was already familiar with kind of going out to a place where there was nothing there and starting a project from scratch, working with the client really closely to bring something to life. A story that is important enough, compelling enough to gain momentum and get loads of people interested in it so that you can make it a reality. So we've been lucky that we have been able to go to these places and start working at the very earliest of stages, master planning, working with them when they don't know that they've got what kind of project they've got in their hands, and we help them craft and create a vision that can then be taken through to a project and completion.
And I guess just to add, now event, like we had the privilege of working in the Middle East, but we're also working in other countries. We have projects currently undergoing in Shenzhen, Singapore, across different countries in the Middle East. Calgary. So finally got a project in Canada, so it brought me closer back to home. And yeah.
I mean, I think there's a message for this conference and the people in this room about the impact, if you like, therefore, of kind of two things. One is, I always think everything comes back to early mid-90s rave culture, right?
Yes.
The things that people were doing in really immersive experience in the mid-90s, and I was lucky to be a teenager at the time. But the ripples still continue now, so that kind of underground culture and the things it did for creative practice, outstanding, and still felt today. But the second bit is that long-term impact of kind of high-level public-funded injections into creative industry. These millennium projects, the ripples of them now are still being felt. And of course, as we're here at Beyond, just as CoSTAR is launching tomorrow, the kind of reaching the peak, if you like, now of another big wave of public funding to support creative industry development. So hopefully, beyond 26 or whenever we get to, 20 years time, the outcomes of what people who are around here doing CoSTAR and audiences of the future will be feeling that then. So look, the long-term effects for everyone, I think, are very strong at least.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, we were chatting earlier, because Chris did a lot of work on the CoSTAR plan. And when you're trying to sell massive public funding initiatives to government, they want hard numbers, they want hard outcomes. And what the decision to take lottery-funded money, lottery tickets, and to inject hundreds of millions of pounds into British museums in the early millennium, what they probably didn't plan for was the growth of an industry that we have here, right across everything, whether it's virtual production, film production, museology, installation work, that wonderful world of immersive, whatever that is. That's all almost like a byproduct of those big gestures. They thought they were just giving money to the national collections because they were looking a bit tired, and they were in the attention game. So I remember going into meetings where they were saying, why should somebody come to the Science Museum when they could be on their PlayStation 2 it would have been. And that was the discussions we were having about how do you create museums for the 21st century. And we were lucky enough in this country to have that injection, which gave that boost and in effect built any number of industries on the back of that.
And look, message to funders in the room: don't stop putting money into this stuff. It is important and it makes a difference, right? I mean, you talked a little bit about the markets you've worked in, which have been the strongest over that sort of 10 to 15 year journey. Where's been the kind of the biggest burst of both creativity from the partners there and the biggest opportunity, you think? And where do you think the opportunity lives in the years ahead?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, obviously, there are opportunities, for example, in the Middle East where there is, where there is money to develop big projects like the one you saw this morning. And there are opportunities that come with that you're able to research and develop and work with incredible specialists all around the world and create something that you have a rare chance to develop sometimes. But while you're doing that, you are also open and listening to what's happening closer to home. They might be projects that are not as ambitious as the ones that you're developing elsewhere in the world, but they're interesting in the same way. They're relevant to audiences. You want to connect with those audiences using storytelling, all of the techniques that we've developed over the years, and you apply the same kind of principles that you are doing at a massive scale in these projects around the world, to a different scale, but with the same kind of impact. Innovation and markets that we target are really where the opportunities of great storytelling lies. It's less about the big scale projects, more about where are those important stories that we want to tell.
Yeah, I mean it's a thread we're going to come back to in a minute. But this idea of kind of UK companies as being great storytellers, I think is one of our export values, right? So, I mean, in the time you've been doing this, how do you think kind of UK design businesses, how are people perceiving them differently now from the way they did 15 years ago? What's the kind of the reputation that you guys kind of work from and with of us as a sector, if you like?
I mean, maybe it's more of a question for clients, I think. You always get a perception when you tender for these projects that the people around the table, they're probably folk in the sense the people you're pitching against. It's you'll occasionally get a big American company coming in. We have a couple of kind of friendly competitors. There's a big German studio we're often up against. There's a big Dutch studio we're often up against. But generally, it's the Brits are there. And I don't know whether a lot of that, certainly in the Gulf, is to do with the history of many of them were British protectorates, and there's a very long, deep, often complex history, troubled history sometimes at times. But there is a link, I think, between a lot of the Gulf states and the UK. English is the de facto language often in business. So I think maybe that opened doors to a certain degree. But Britain has always punched above its weight creatively, whether it's film, literature, hopefully around interactivity and so on. And I think that kind of almost like that halo goes with you when you travel abroad. You're expected to be creative, but there's a weird thing with chat the other day. You're expected to be creative, but you're expected to work in a very structural way. I remember when I was at art school, when they were trying to sum up what British creativity was, they always used to talk about punk and pageantry. That idea that you've got punk rock on one hand and you've got regal stuff from Buckingham Palace and the troops are out and so on. And I think there is something in that. There is something in that there is a creative exploration. Maybe it comes out of our art schools. Maybe it comes out of the different kind of communities that we have in the UK. But it's a great calling card actually when you do appear at those kind of presentations and meetings.
Yeah, I absolutely second that. There's I think an aspect of having worked abroad in so many places throughout the years that you build this experience of collaborating with incredible talent from around the world, and some of it also is here in our doorstep. People who we trust and who we've worked with so many times in the past. Creating what clients call world-class museums and experiences. So they do look for companies that have got that range of work that could be, the scale of the projects that we work in, or the subject matters that we work in, or the type of techniques that we've used in one project or the other. There's a wide range of services that they need that we can offer, from advice services at the very front end of projects, master planning, feasibility studies, and so on and so forth, all the way to the completion of a project. And even after that, museums and clients come back to us to think about what their next 10 years will be like, and ask us to kind of come back and think with them about that next stage in their process, or 50 years. Last year we finished a master plan with the new science center in Singapore, and this is an institution that's been going strong for 50 years. They know what they're doing, but they still would like to kind of talk to us about how can we develop our visitor experience for the next 50 years of this institution, and we can help them think about that and work with them through that. So I think also that range of projects, range of services that we provide, and the kind of talent that we know, the people that we've worked with in the past, all of those collaborations form part of that kind of world-class idea that clients seek.
And I mean, you kind of hinted it a bit, but there's lots of people in the room from much earlier stage kind of creative technology businesses here. If it's kind of success stories, if you like, of kind of how to make it work in international markets. Like, what advice would you give to people in the room for kind of, if you're just going out, if you're just starting to work with partners, whether it's in the Gulf or anywhere around the world, like, what are the things you have to do well to kind of make it to succeed?
Well, where do you start? I think one thing we enjoy doing is we work with partners who do their thing really well, and we do our thing really well. And I love clients who know their stuff really well, really amazing curators who know everything about their collection, but they don't want to be filmmakers in the same way I don't want to be an architect. So I think that's one of the things, to look for partners where you have an absolute complement in terms of attitude and ambition, but you have very, very different specialist skills. That may sound obvious, I don't know, but often it doesn't. Often you do partner with folk and those edges aren't quite as defined.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's the power of the story. It is, if you go to a place like Oman, where they want the youth of the country to understand how the country was before this Renaissance period since the 1970s. They wanted to engage that audience, and they were talking to us about we're going to need technology everywhere because we want the youth to be entertained. We want them to come to the museum and play with interactives and go into 4D, 5D, 6D, 7D theaters. And we're like, whoa, okay. There's this idea that technology, for technology's sake, is going to be, what draws people in. And I think that one of the things that we've learned, and we obviously saw it in this project in Oman, was the power of a simple story that people can just put their weight behind and see through. So, this is the country before the 1970s, this is a country after the 1970s. It's been a journey, it's inspirational, great. We took that story and we created a simple vision, a design vision for this museum, easy to communicate, so that we didn't have to go through the whole of these 6-7 years briefing an army of people who came into the project to do their bit. It was a story that was easy enough to understand, compelling enough to get, that when people were trusted to make the decisions about their aspect, their specialty, they would not need to come back to us necessarily for the direction. They would know the story and they would make the educated decisions that made everything kind of come together in the end.
I guess another piece of advice would be to listen, to be aware of who your audience is, and to be aware of their cultural sensitivities. Ultimately, we're not designing these museum experiences for ourselves. We're creating platforms where the curators, we're empowering them to tell their own story. And so it's really important to kind of go in there with that kind of cultural awareness and understanding.
I think that's a really good point. And just to close out this session, I mean, I've worked heavily with Qatar particularly. I think the point I was just saying, don't think it doesn't matter. Like, these are new, particularly the Gulf, these are new countries where national identities being formed, national stories are being told for the first time. We're very lucky as Brits, right? We get to discount our collective histories every day in lots of different, kind of crazy ways. It really matters in those countries to kind of tell their stories for the first time. So that kind of respect, and you say participation around storytelling, to me, that's the critical bit. You just got to understand how deeply emotionally these projects really matter. So we're going to move on to talk about then kind of the changing world of museums. So when I've worked in and around the museum sector for the last decade, there's kind of decades of experience here around the table. I mean, over your time working with them, what's changed about museums? You say, Damien, kind of going back to the 2000s, it was kind of, these places are looking a bit dusty, let's make them a bit cooler. But I mean, what's been the kind of arc that's happening both here and abroad?
I think one of the things we found, and it was actually when we started to do projects out in the Gulf, in that you were dealing with cultures that they have, what do we call it the other day, an intangible heritage. And they're often the societies that don't have a history of collecting objects, they were often nomadic. So you don't have rooms full of brown objects. You don't have drawers full of photographs and illustrations. And what we found on those projects, we were again tasked with how do you tell stories in innovative ways, innovative tech maybe, or innovative production. But you're still telling stories, but we were kind of simulating history, and we were creating, I'll call them virtual environments, but via screens and via projection and so on. And it was almost a forerunner of what you're now seeing with these big pop-up immersive shows, where purely digital environments are being created. And then the first time we felt that was being pulled back to Europe was when we worked with these guys on the Titanic Belfast, where they also don't have a huge object collection because most of it is on the bottom of the Atlantic Sea or in American private collections. So that is a £100 million museum that was gifted to the city by the developers of the waterfront, but it had almost no objects to fill it. So that became what the first big European project we did, where it's almost purely digital. And on the back of that, the same developers got us to do Epic Island in Dublin, which is an incredible museum in the old, the vaults of the old customs house on the Liffey. And again, they had zero. You open the collection door and there was nothing there. So creating, 30 vaults of content that tell the story of the Irish people and of the emigration, it is a challenge, but it was stuff we'd already almost dry ran on the Gulf projects. So we see that there are kind of reverberations back the way. But I think there is a little bit of a global museum culture developing. You do see trends. And the people in that world are at conferences like this, and they are jumping on planes to go and see the latest museum that's open and so on. So you're seeing much more of a dialogue, I think, in the last few years than there was previously.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I see happening is obviously the global trends that affect everything in life also impact museums. So we see a lot more consciousness in being accessible to a wide range of audiences. So reaching out to those people who might otherwise feel that they're not kind of part of that museum culture, to bring them into museums and where in places where they can feel reflected, they can feel represented. So that's a key thing, I think, that is happening right now. And obviously, the environmental challenges that we face, museum institutions are very keen on that and thinking about how they invest in their capital projects, thinking about how long they might last, what would be the impact of the project, both on the environment but also on the audience they're trying to reach. Being very conscious of all of that work. And we also see loads of institutions who have been running strong for many years rethink their mission, their vision. And also we see museums that are massive, kind of taking over quarters in a kind of way that we haven't experienced in the past. Which brings in different challenges. I mean, we've been now talking about several museums where they're so big that no one company can do it all on their own. So they're bringing in different teams to do different parts of the museum, which force people to collaborate or encourage people to collaborate, should I say. And which is, an incredibly enriching experience, to find yourself working with teams of incredibly talented designers and content developers and project managers, people who think about the same things that you think about, and doing it collaboratively, not competitively, is something that is, I think, quite amazing.
So another thing that we're seeing right now is client briefs coming to us where they're listing out all of the buzzwords. So they will say that they want AI, they want immersive, they want augmented reality, they want virtual reality. What's really interesting is talking to them and getting to the kind of core of why they're wanting these different experiences. So it's not tech for tech's sake. We also need to make sure that we're employing tech that is tried, tested, and true, while respecting their ambition to bring in the latest and newest technologies. But it's about creating emotive experiences and really engaging with your audiences. So what we're trying to do is really understand what the kind of emotional outcome we want for visitors in each of the spaces, and understanding that and then applying the technology that would best work for that case.
I mean, there's a kind of period of risk, isn't there, in a way, when suddenly every museum in the world that can afford it decides it wants to do cool tech stuff. The risk of doing bad tech stuff as a result is super high, right?
There are cupboards full of VR headsets in most major museums. We actually spend a lot of our time, through my colleague Verena, who's with us with our kind of R&D team in ISO Labs, we actually spend a lot of time with clients trying to de-risk technology, in that we work in a very kind of demanding environment, and that once you install one of these installations, there's a good chance it's going to be there for the next 10 years. So there's not many bits of tech which run, 364 days a year, 18 hours a day, with minimum kind of technical support. So you create these closed systems. You're not patching things, you're not updating OSs, you create, in effect, a completely closed system. That's our recommendation. Sometimes they need to be dynamic or hitched up to the internet or whatever. But a lot of our time, clients are often sold the next great thing. And you really do need things that are robust and battle hardened, that you can get parts for. And I think, one of the themes of today is about R&D, and we love R&D, we invest quite a lot in R&D, but I think there's a difference between prototypes and proof of concept exhibits, installations, and things that are going to be installed and run indefinitely. And they're a very, very different beast. So as I say, part of our job, I think, is often to say to clients, you don't want to go that way. Or let's give it another 2 years, and in the meantime, let's try this. And you often find, back to what Amanda was saying, what they actually want to say is they want to tell a story in a certain way. And you go, well, you could be doing that in 3D sound really easily. Don't put people in a headset. There are different ways we can manage that. So often it's unpicking what the actual intent is, as opposed to hitching the tech on straight away.
Sorry, just to jump in there. So often what we're doing is we're trying to create experiences, collective experiences. Visiting a museum is such a social activity that we're trying to prevent limiting people and putting them in little isolated worlds. We want visitors to engage with each other, to exhibit social behavior, be pointing out things to each other, be calling someone over to see something exciting and new. So yeah, we're trying to find ways of creating these collective experiences while still creating the sense of immersion. But immersion isn't always projections on walls.
There is a place for R&D in the museums themselves, involving audiences throughout the life and the operation of a museum. I think, encouraging innovation is great, but with a kind of mindset that things may fail, they will fail. How do you deal with that? What can you learn from that? Again, working with the new Science Centre in Singapore, one of the things that we were thinking about was how can we bring in that R&D into the gallery space so that we work things together with our public, with our audience, with our guests, so that we can test things. And if things look taped up, they're taped up for a reason. If things are broken down, maybe this technology fell, we'll try something else. Having the possibility of integrating that level of work for a purpose and to engage people to, again, opening up that space for a wider audience to participate is something that is, I think, to be encouraged.
I think those are two really important points. And as someone who, when I was in the museum sector, ran an innovation lab exactly for that reason, to give a chance to kind of experiment with technologies and experiment with their intersection with an audience, absolutely, crucially important thing to do. And I would recommend any museum out there, the audience, to try and find ways to create a structured innovation program. But when you put it in front of your, 2 million, 5 million, 10 million people per year, make sure it works. When I was first made head of digital at the British Museum, I just went around and did an audit of all the screens that didn't work on public display, and it was a lot. And there was no money to fix them. So when you put it out there, make sure that there's robust resilience.
There's a friend of mine who's a filmmaker for museums and hates interactives, and he's built an online collection of the sticky taped photocopied signs saying this exhibit is out of order. That's his personal collection.
Yeah, that's niche. I like it though. It's good. Right, we're going to go on and do a few case studies, but I do want to give time for people to ask some questions at the end. So I'm going to maybe ask you to pick just one each that you'd like to talk about from what's quite a long list, and then give you kind of like a minute or two to just talk about each one. So I don't know who wants to go first. So I think we've done this one. We're done. Happy? People can ask questions. Burrell. Someone talk about the Burrell. What an amazing British project.
I'll take that one as it's our home turf. So the Burrell collection in Glasgow has just undergone a huge remodelling. They've opened up, I think, 40% of space. They've opened up the collection. As most museums, 90% of it is hidden away, and they've actually opened that up. And we've made a feature of actually looking into the collection stores and used private light glass to go from big video screens to literally seeing the curators and the conservation team at work. Some of the things that stood out for us on that, they literally did give us the brief of how do you bring this room full of brown objects to life. So one of the things they were very bold about, and this is shout out to Glasgow Live, was putting really large media surfaces, big screens, all the way through the museum. And a lot of museums are very nervous about that. But what it meant, at that time we were doing lots of work around photogrammetry and 3D scanning, and it meant we could scan those really beautiful brown objects and blow them up. So you literally have, I don't know if I've got any images there. No, okay. You literally have that beautiful pot in front of you, but you're seeing it at a scale where you can almost step in and be running with the Greek hoplites around the edge of the thing. They were also very playful. One thing that I think is often missed from the curation side is having fun. So one thing we loved was there was a brief for about 10 installations that were aimed at under fives. And that let you do the things that you don't normally let kids do. There's one exhibit where you try hats on with the lady and the painting. It's obviously digital, but you know, you're putting a tam o'shanter on her at 1 minute, and obviously that's the wrong hat, and then you trying different hats. Or there was another one where using gesture tech, you could in effect paint walls with digital paint. Again, all projections, but that was explaining to the kids how all those lovely white statues were actually fully coloured originally. So you could do learning through fun. The thing we didn't expect was how much the adults loved it. So one thing I'll often take from that project is don't be afraid just to have a bit of fun.
Right, next one. I think we've done, let's do epic.
All right. I was going to do a little bit of the Burl.
You want to do a bit of barrel too? Okay,
Yeah, sorry.
okay. If we only do one, that's fine.
I was just going to take it back a bit to the beginning, where this is one of 3 major projects that we've done in Glasgow. And it was one of the first in which they said, we're going to bring in the exhibition designers first as the lead consultants for a massive regeneration project. And as part of their team, they'll need to bring in architects and conservation architects. This, very contemporary looking building was listed 2 years after it was finished. And then the roof failed and started leaking, which meant that the whole of the collection was at risk and therefore put in storage under tarp, and people couldn't access it. So the main thing that they wanted was, how do we make all of that collection accessible to people again? One is we put it out there in a building that is fit for purpose. Second, we transform the space into a place where people actually want to go see and feel that they are welcome there, that it's not a snobby place where some people don't want to be going to see art. It's a place for everyone, and making it a place where everyone has something to do, to see, to feel. And so all of those premises were what we worked with in the creation of the master plan that then led to the work that we did afterwards.
Great. We've only got 5 minutes left. So what I'd love to do is just see if there's anyone in the audience who'd like to ask a question to anyone sitting here. Yes, lady in the back, your hand was up the fastest.
Do you see a trend in the subject matters that the museum wants to go for?
Yeah, I do actually. There's a real interest in well-being. There's a real interest in making museums places where people can come in and, as part of, having access to culture, as part of improving the quality of their lives. And I think visitors and institutions are very receptive to that.
And building on that with this sense of well-being, a lot of museums are telling narratives through universal human experiences. So making everything very relatable for their audiences, so there's an immediate hook for them into the story and for helping them understand.
And I think just one thing to note for me, science and arts coming back together is a big theme of the next few years. So Powerhouse Parramatta, $1 billion investment in Sydney, brand new museum, all about art and science coming together. Amazing new gallery being built, opening next year in Bangalore, all about art and science coming back to art science in Singapore, of course, it's in the name. So that kind of STEM and the arts being separate has been very damaging. Museums are part of the kind of the healing process of bringing them back together. Yes, sir.
Yeah. This session's called Museums and Storytelling, isn't it? Or that's the theme. It begs the question of whose stories are you telling when you build these museums? Because there are lots of stories to a museum in Oman, and is it telling the story of the guy who's paying for it, or where do those other stories come out of this process? Or do you go into it agenda light and go, we'll do as we're required and we have no need to address a social justice agenda?
I mean, you kind of answered your own question in a way. You do go. you go into a project listening. There's a brief, of course, that you respond to, and you provide your creative approach, and you get it or you don't get it. But as soon as you get a project, you go in to listen. And if there's a story that is a national story to be told, there are multiple voices who tell that story. So in the case of Oman, yes, the ultimate stakeholder was His Majesty the Sultan, but he had a team of advisors, very close advisors. At the beginning, they had what was called the scientific committee, who steered our work in the first phases of the project. We did our own research. We came to the table with ideas, with stories, and they would give us direction. They challenged us to think about ways of telling the stories that they knew as kids, but they struggled to transfer those stories to their own kids, and how we could find ways of engaging them more and more. So in the case of Oman, we had, yes, ultimately a main stakeholder, but we had, an incredible amount of people ranging from subject experts from across the world with often opposing views on things. And that conversation was completely open in the process. And through, kind of collaboration and, consensus, there's a direction that is then taken.
Sure. Just come out another way. Are there any regimes whose stories you wouldn't tell?
At the beginning of every project, I think there is a question of, do we go for it or don't we go for it? And I think there's one underlying principle that we have, which is our work going to advance, the kind of humanity culture? Is it improving? Is it making things better, or is it advancing something that we don't feel is right? And that decision point is key.
And I think, don't underestimate some of what's already happening in some of the Gulf states, particularly. The first art show I went to in Doha was a show of Saudi trans and LGBT plus artists. That was very surprising to me as a kind of not very knowledgeable Westerner when I turned up that would be, and of course every art show is part of the mechanisms of the state. So, don't underestimate the changes in those cultures. We've got time for one more question before we end. Yes.
Hi. When you have a collection, a physical collection, in most cases, the older the collection gets, the more valuable it becomes. In the case when you're working with kind of putting intangible cultural heritage into digital form, how are you designing that so that those items are still relevant in 10 years, 20 years when the tech has moved on? How do you design that?
One of the ways we try and design that in is if it's capturing 3D objects, for instance, is to capture it at the highest quality we can now. Standards will always change, formats will change, and I think it is one of the great challenges of long-term digital preservation. There's any number of issues. We did an interesting project with Glasgow School of Art after Fire 1, where they painstakingly conserved Laocoon, the fabulous sculpture of Laocoon, which was a really interesting debate about preservation and replicas, in that the original bronze is based on a marble, and then the plaster copy that was in the art school was a third generation Italian 19th century copy. That had been badly damaged, was then repaired. We ended up scanning it, really high resolution 3D scans, and created a VR experience from that. The Laocoon was then boxed up and put in the basement of the art school, and a month before it was due to reopen, the place caught fire again. Laocoon doesn't exist. The digital scan does exist. In that case, that is now the latest version of Laocoon from that kind of progeny. Now, there's no doubt that I think within 5 years' time, we're then going to be having to do some session looking at how do we reinterpolate that? How do we increase the resolution? Neil and his team from Glasgow Uni are here today, and they've got an amazing project called Museums in the Metaverse, which is all about that. How do you capture collections at the best quality you can, but then also deal with building licensing? How do you limit certain rights? How can you pull an object if it's being misused? And that, I think, is going to be the questions around the digital assets that we're going to be wrestling with.
We are sadly out of time. I get the impression we could keep going for hours on this brilliant subject. But look, I'd like to thank, first of all, you all for joining me for this session. I'd love to thank our speakers, and look, enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.